Welcome, viewers. You are about to hear a captivating tale written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. Join me as we uncover the chilling truth behind the butcher's knife and the unseen hands that control it all. Don't forget to subscribe. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Case of the Invisible Butcher. The fog hung heavy in the streets of London, curling around lampposts and weaving through narrow alleys as though it sought to swallow the city whole. It was the kind of night that Sherlock Holmes found most invigorating, silent, yet full of secrets, hiding in every corner. The sharp click of his polished boots against the cobblestone echoed through the mist, steady and purposeful. Beside him, Dr. John Watson walked with less assurance, the weight of their evening's events heavy on his shoulders. He had never quite grown accustomed to the murkiness of London after dark, nor to the shiver that crept up his spine when Holmes's mind raced at full throttle. It was this unsettling stillness that Holmes thrived in, like a predator sizing up its next move. Holmes's eyes flickered from shadow to shadow, each movement under the cloak of fog noted with a detective's sharpness. The glow from distant street lamps barely penetrated the thick mist, casting the world in a soft, sickly light. Despite the familiar surroundings of Baker Street, the city felt alien tonight. Holmes had been restless lately, as though the weight of countless cases had begun to settle uneasily on his shoulders. It had been some time since a case truly stirred his curiosity. The routine had become tiresome, and for Holmes there was little more insufferable than the dull, predictable turn of the everyday. Watson, ever the observant companion, was aware of the change in Holmes. The man he had shared so many investigations with, whose mind had once been a constant flurry of excitement, seemed distant now, quieter. It was subtle, but Watson could see it in the way Holmes would absent-mindedly twirl his walking stick in his hands or tap his fingers against his chin. He was searching for something, but what, Watson could not yet tell. It was in the early hours of that same evening that the invitation arrived, as unexpected as it was urgent. The note had come by a small, nervous messenger boy, and, upon reading its contents, Holmes had shown an almost immediate shift in demeanour, a gleam returning to his sharp eyes. Watson, though accustomed to the peculiarities of his friend's temperament, could not ignore the flicker of excitement that danced across Holmes's usually impassive face. The note was brief, yet to the point. An oddity had occurred at a butcher's shop just off of Fleet Street, something that had caught the attention of a local constable. It was vague, almost annoyingly so, but Holmes had read between the lines with his usual precision. It was the mention of something being invisible, an aspect that caught Holmes's attention like a sudden gust of wind shifting the fog. He had mentioned little of the details to Watson, but the excitement was palpable in his movements, his stride lengthening as they neared their destination. "There's something peculiar about this," Holmes muttered, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with unmistakable certainty. "A butcher, you say? Yet no sign of a struggle, no trace of blood, and yet they speak of an invisible force at play. I have my suspicions, Watson. This may be the very thing I've been waiting for." Watson could not contain his curiosity. "An invisible force? Holmes, do you truly believe such a thing exists?" Holmes turned his eyes toward him, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Invisible, Watson, does not mean non-existent. There are methods yet unknown to most, and a butcher's craft may hold secrets beyond the surface." As they reached the alleyway where the butcher's shop stood, Holmes paused for a moment. The shop was small, tucked between two grand buildings, its windows dim and its sign, a faded, nearly illegible script, barely hanging on. It seemed like just another forgotten corner of London, but Holmes knew better. His eyes darted to the broken sign hanging crookedly above the entrance. A flicker of movement inside, just beyond the fog, caught his attention. "Let us proceed," Holmes said, his voice low but decisive. With that he stepped forward, his cloak swirling around his legs as Watson followed, the fog thickening around them, the mysteries of the night unfolding one step at a time. The butcher's shop was dark inside, the faintest trace of light spilling through the small, grimy windows. A heavy, unpleasant smell clung to the air, a blend of old meat and dust. enough to make Watson grimace as he stepped over the threshold. His eyes adjusted to the dimness as he followed Holmes into the shop. The faint, flickering light from a single oil lamp cast long shadows across the room, illuminating rusted tools and a butcher's block that looked untouched for years. Yet there was a strange cleanliness to the space, a meticulous order that seemed out of place for a butcher's shop long abandoned. Holmes, however, moved with an unhurried precision, his gaze darting across the room as if already processing each minute detail. His coat brushed against the edge of the counter as he carefully examined the floor beneath the butcher's block. Watson, feeling the oppressive weight of the silence and the strange chill in the air, cleared his throat, trying to dispel the unease creeping up his spine. He had seen Holmes in many such places, crime scenes, abandoned buildings, but this one felt different. The shop, despite its emptiness, gave off a sense of urgency, a feeling that something was being hidden just out of view. "What do you make of this, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice echoing slightly in the otherwise silent room. Holmes did not immediately respond, his fingers brushing across the surface of the butcher's block, noting the faint scratches and the residue that remained. It was as though he could see things that the eye could not. He stood still for a moment, eyes narrowing in thought. Then slowly he turned to Watson, his face inscrutable, but there was a fire in his eyes that could not be mistaken. "This place is not abandoned, Watson. Whoever occupied this shop has taken pains to erase their presence, but they have left clues, small, almost invisible details that could easily be overlooked by an untrained eye." Holmes paused, his gaze shifting to a small, half-burnt piece of cloth near the corner. "It is a deliberate attempt to hide something, to mislead us." Watson stepped forward, kneeling to inspect the cloth Holmes had pointed to. It was a thin, faded rag, half charred as though it had been in a fire but discarded in haste. He frowned, his mind working to understand what Holmes saw. "A fire? But there's no sign of one here, no soot, no damage, just..." Holmes did not look at the cloth again. He was already moving to the back of the shop, his mind clearly racing ahead of the moment. "Indeed, whoever is responsible has covered their tracks well, and yet..." Holmes paused, his voice dropping slightly. "The butcher's tools, Watson. They are too well maintained, too meticulously arranged, not a speck of dust. Whoever was here knew what they were doing." Watson's eyes followed Holmes, noticing now the gleam of the tools on the counter. Razor-sharp knives, neatly organized, each in its place. It struck him as odd, too orderly for a shop that had apparently been out of business for some time. The lingering sense of unease only grew stronger. Holmes had already moved past him, eyes scanning the shelves for anything else that might stand out. The door creaked open behind them, and a soft voice broke through the stillness of the shop. Watson turned to see an elderly man standing in the doorway, his face creased with worry. His thin frame trembled slightly as he stepped inside, his eyes darting nervously to Holmes. "I was told you would come," the man said, his voice hoarse, almost whispering. "I'm Edward Mason. I used to run this shop, but I haven't been here for months." Holmes didn't immediately acknowledge the man's presence, instead focusing on the way Mason stood at the threshold, his posture stiff, his hands clasped in front of him as if trying to hold something back. Watson stepped forward, his gaze appraising the man. He was an unremarkable figure, thin, grey hair and a face that had seen years of hard work and little rest. But there was something about him, a nervous energy that seemed out of place. "What do you know about what happened here?" Watson asked, his tone gentle but firm. "Why did you leave?" Mason hesitated, shifting his weight uncomfortably. His eyes flicked to Holmes, then back to Watson, his voice almost cracking. It's not what you think, sir. The shop. It was my livelihood. I never wanted to leave, but something happened, something strange." Holmes finally turned to face him, his gaze piercing, though his face remained neutral. "Strange, you say?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge of curiosity beneath it. "And what might that have been?" Mason swallowed hard, his hands trembling. I don't know. I don't know if I can explain, but every night Someone would come, not like a customer. No, this person, Mason shuddered visibly, this person would bring things, Holmes pressed, stepping closer, his voice quiet but insistent. Mason looked around nervously, as though expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. Things that weren't, not meant for sale. Things that shouldn't have been in a butcher's shop. I couldn't be part of it. I couldn't. Holmes's expression remained unreadable, but Watson could see his eyes narrow slightly, the way they did when he was on the verge of something important. "What kind of things, Mr. Mason?" Watson asked, his tone now sharper, sensing that they were on the edge of something far deeper than a simple abandoned shop. Mason hesitated, his lips trembling as he glanced nervously at the door. I can't say more. You'll need to go to the police. If you want to know more, they'll tell you." Holmes did not move, his eyes fixed on the man, as though weighing his every word. For a moment the silence between them felt charged, as though Mason had just opened a door into something much darker than anyone had expected. Holmes stood motionless, his piercing gaze never leaving Mason, who now seemed to shrink under the weight of the detective's scrutiny. The tension in the room was palpable, and Watson could feel his own breath catch in his throat. The mention of things that shouldn't have been in a butcher's shop had struck a nerve. It was as though they had just uncovered a small sliver of a much larger, darker puzzle. Holmes glanced at Watson, then at the man in front of him. "You will not tell us what these things were?" Holmes's voice was calm, almost mechanical, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now, one that Watson had come to recognize all too well. When Holmes was on the verge of an insight, the entire world seemed to disappear for him. Mason shifted uncomfortably. His eyes flicked nervously to the door and then to the floor. I can't. I don't even know who was bringing them. It was just strange deliveries. They never made sense." Holmes took a step closer, his face now mere inches from Mason's. "I believe you know more than you are letting on, Mr. Mason." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Tell me everything. It is in your best interest." Mason's lips trembled, his hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment it seemed as though he might collapse under the pressure. But then, as if coming to a sudden decision, he sighed heavily and gestured toward the back of the shop. "It's in the cellar," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You need to see it for yourselves." Holmes didn't hesitate. He moved swiftly toward the door that led to the cellar, his coat billowing behind him. Watson followed closely, his heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and foreboding. As they descended into the dimly lit cellar, the air grew noticeably colder. A faint, musty smell lingered in the air, mingling with something else, something metallic. It was the smell of blood, but not fresh. No, this was older, stagnant, as if the very walls of the cellar had absorbed it over time. The cellar was cluttered with crates and old barrels, many of them overturned and forgotten in the dim light. Holmes's eyes immediately honed in on a large, rusted metal door at the far end, tucked behind a stack of old meat hooks and barrels. He approached it without a word, his fingers tracing the edges of the doorframe as though searching for something hidden. Watson stood back, his eyes scanning the rest of the cellar. There was a heaviness to the air, a sense that something terrible had been concealed here for far too long. The strange combination of decay and the faint metallic scent lingered, making him uneasy. He caught a glimpse of a tarnished butcher's cleaver resting atop a wooden crate, and for a moment he imagined it being used, not for cutting meat, but for something far more sinister. Holmes turned back to Watson with a single sharp glance. "Here," he said simply, his tone almost grim. He reached for the door, and as he pushed it open, a faint creak echoed in the silence, as though the cellar itself were protesting the intrusion. Inside was a small, windowless room, its stone walls covered in grime. At the center of the room, illuminated by the flickering light from Holmes's lantern, lay a butcher's table, its surface stained dark with dried blood. But it was not the table that caught Watson's attention. It was the array of objects scattered around it. There were jars filled with strange, unsettling contents, Some were labelled in scrawled handwriting, but the words were smudged or half erased, making them unintelligible. Others contained preserved meat, but the labels were entirely blank, and the meat itself appeared grotesquely altered. Watson's stomach churned at the sight. Holmes's eyes moved methodically from jar to jar, each one revealing something more grotesque than the last. It was as if some kind of macabre ritual had been carried out here, something far beyond the ordinary work of a butcher. "Look at this," Holmes murmured, lifting one of the jars carefully, his brow furrowing. The jar contained what appeared to be a human finger, severed at the knuckle and surrounded by a viscous liquid. Watson felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Holmes, what is all this?" he asked, his voice strained. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the contents of the jar with a mixture of fascination and repulsion. "It seems that the invisible force Mason spoke of is not so much a matter of sight as it is a matter of concealment," Holmes said at last, his voice calm but filled with an unmistakable undercurrent of horror. "Someone has been using this shop for something far darker than anyone could have imagined." Watson looked at the other jars, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. The gruesome displays spoke of a butcher's work, yes, but they were not meant for consumption. They were symbols. Of what? Watson couldn't say, but he knew that these were not the remnants of any normal crime. A feeling of dread settled over him, and he looked at Holmes, his voice barely above a whisper. "Holmes, what do you think this all means?" Holmes didn't respond immediately. His mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the clues, forming a theory, but he was not ready to share it yet. There was more to uncover, more hidden in the dark corners of this forgotten shop. "I believe we have only just begun to scratch the surface," Holmes said, his voice low, filled with a quiet resolve. "But one thing is certain, this is no ordinary butcher's shop, Watson, and the man behind this, he is no ordinary criminal." The silence in the cellar was oppressive, as though it too was aware of the horrors concealed within. Holmes stood still for a moment, his fingers absent-mindedly turning the jar in his hand. The dim light from his lantern flickered and danced across the grotesque contents, casting long, trembling shadows on the stone walls. The faint smell of decay, blood, and something far more unsettling hung in the air, choking the very life from the space. Watson, unable to shake the cold dread that had settled deep in his bones, stood at the threshold of the room. His eyes flitted nervously from one jar to the next, the grisly displays making his stomach turn. He stepped back, uneasy, unable to stomach the sight of the preserved body parts and the strange concoctions that filled the jars. "Holmes," he said softly, his voice shaky, "this is beyond anything we've seen before." Holmes didn't respond immediately. Instead, he set the jar down carefully, his eyes scanning the room with surgical precision. Every detail, no matter how minute, was of interest to him. "Indeed," he murmured, more to himself than to Watson. "The question is why? Why would anyone go to such lengths to hide something so macabre?" A low sigh escaped his lips as he began pacing around the room. His eyes lingered on the cluttered shelves and the piles of discarded meat. It was a butcher's shop, yes, but there was an unsettling wrongness to it. The walls, once sturdy and clean, were now stained with years of grime. A certain kind of madness clung to the air, one that seemed to speak of a darker purpose behind the shop's long-forgotten purpose. Watson moved closer, inspecting the butcher's table where the blood had long dried. "It looks as though the table was used for something more ritualistic, doesn't it?" he said, his voice tentative. Holmes nodded but said nothing. His focus remained fixed on the wall opposite the table, where the faintest smudge of something caught his eye. Moving toward it with the practiced grace of a man accustomed to finding what others overlooked, he leaned in close. "There," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "A mark, almost imperceptible." Watson stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. The mark was faint but noticeable enough under the flickering light. It resembled a series of sharp, deliberate scratches, as though someone had clawed at the wall in desperation. There was something off about it, a sense of urgency, but no sign of blood or any visible reason for the damage. Holmes's gaze deepened as he ran his finger along the scratches, tracing the uneven line. "I've seen marks like this before," Holmes said, his voice thoughtful. "In places where someone is trying to conceal something. This isn't the work of an ordinary man. It's calculated." Watson's heart skipped a beat. "Calculated?" he repeated, a sense of dread beginning to settle over him. "Are you saying this person is still using this shop?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched down to inspect a nearby crate, his eyes scanning the room for any further clues. Watson, unable to contain his anxiety, took a step forward. "Holmes, we have to contact the authorities," he urged, his voice a mix of fear and determination. This is beyond us." Holmes shot him a look, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Beyond us, Watson? I assure you this is exactly where we need to be. The authorities would not know what to make of this. They wouldn't see the significance." Watson frowned, but before he could reply, Holmes stood up with a sudden shift of energy, his gaze locking onto something across the room. A shelf, cluttered with old butcher's tools, appeared to have been disturbed recently. There was a faint trail of dust along the shelf, as though something had been moved just within the past few hours. "Someone has been here recently," Holmes stated, his voice now steady and sure. "The dust, the way these tools have been disturbed, it's not a matter of coincidence. This was a place for a very particular purpose, and someone, Watson, has been using it for far more than what we've seen." Watson's pulse quickened, but Holmes was already moving, his mind turning over the possibilities. The cellar's location, hidden away beneath the butcher's shop, suggests a certain secrecy. Whatever was happening here, it was meant to remain hidden from the world. But now, it's too late. As Holmes continued to examine the shelves, Watson's gaze returned to the jars, each one containing a horrifying piece of evidence. The finger in one jar, the misshapen meat in another. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something far darker. And though Holmes was as calm as ever, Watson could sense that his mind was already racing, already piecing together a theory that he wasn't yet ready to share. "What do you think, Holmes?" Watson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Holmes did not turn to face him, but his eyes remained fixed on the objects before him. "I think, Watson, that we've only begun to understand the scope of this crime. Whoever is behind this, they are far more dangerous than we anticipated." The chill of the cellar still lingered on Watson's skin as they emerged from the dark, grimy depths of the butcher's shop. Holmes remained eerily calm, but Watson could feel the mounting weight of the mystery pressing down on them both. The more they uncovered, the deeper the hole seemed to go, pulling them further into the twisted web of deceit and violence that now seemed so deeply woven into the very fabric of the city. They stood at the threshold of the shop, Watson glancing nervously over his shoulder at the gloom that still hung over the cellar. Holmes, ever the enigma, seemed unperturbed, his focus shifting entirely to the next step in their investigation. His mind, Watson knew, was already several moves ahead, even as they made their way back out onto the fog-choked street. Holmes turned his attention to the people who might hold the answers, and their first stop was the nearby tavern where several local shopkeepers often gathered after hours. The tavern was warm, a stark contrast to the cold and damp of the streets outside. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of roasting meat and stale ale. The low murmur of conversation filled the room, and the fire crackled in the hearth, offering a false sense of comfort that only heightened the tension for Watson. "Holmes, I don't know if I can handle much more of this," Watson muttered under his breath, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. "This shop, the strange objects in the cellar, something isn't right. We need to find answers before it's too late." Holmes paused for a moment, his eyes fixed on the hearth. "Patience, Watson. We are merely scratching the surface. This is far from over. But rest assured, I will uncover the truth." With that, Holmes strode toward the nearest group of men gathered near the bar. They were a rough-looking bunch, dressed in worn coats and stained aprons, their faces lined with years of hard work. They eyed Holmes warily as he approached, but something in the way he carried himself, a subtle authority perhaps, was enough to silence any hesitation. "Good evening, gentlemen," Holmes began smoothly, his voice like silk. "I am investigating a matter of some importance, and I believe you may be able to assist me." There was a brief silence before one of the men, a burly fellow with a thick beard, scoffed. "I don't know what you're after, but you'd best move on, friend. Ain't no business in here for your sort." Holmes didn't flinch, his expression unchanging. "I believe you know more than you're letting on, my good man. A butcher's shop nearby has recently fallen into disrepair, and I suspect that someone among you may know the truth behind its downfall." The burly man eyed him with suspicion, but Holmes remained calm, his eyes never leaving the man's. There was a certain precision to the way Holmes spoke, a methodical rhythm to his words that left no room for argument. After a tense pause, the man let out a heavy sigh and leaned in closer. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low. "Mason, the butcher, he ain't been right in the head for months, ever since the fire. People said he started bringing in strange things. Didn't want no one knowing about it, but we all saw it. Whatever was going on, he was mixed up in it, and it weren't pretty." Watson glanced at Holmes, his mind racing as the pieces started to fit together. "A fire?" Watson asked, his brow furrowing. "What fire? When did it happen?" The man looked around nervously, as if unsure of how much to reveal. "It's not just the fire," he said in a hushed tone. "It's the deliveries, strange boxes, strange folks. It wasn't like the usual. Something else was going on down there, and no one wanted to ask too many questions, not with what Mason started doing." Holmes pressed further, his voice steady but insistent. "And these deliveries, do you know where they came from or who was behind them?" The man hesitated, casting furtive glances at the others in the room before leaning even closer. "I don't know much, but there's talk. Some say he was working with someone who had the means to make things disappear, so to speak, but that's all I know. If you want to know more, you'd have to ask Mason." Holmes gave the man a measured nod, his gaze shifting to the rest of the room. The other men had fallen silent, listening intently to the conversation. It was clear that they too knew more than they let on, but the fear of speaking too openly held them back. Holmes stood up straight, his coat swishing around him with an air of finality. "Thank you for your time, gentlemen. I'm sure your information will prove invaluable in the course of this investigation." As they made their way back toward the door, Watson couldn't help but feel a sense of unease wash over him. The mention of strange boxes and the lingering implication of some shadowy figure working alongside Mason made his stomach tighten. He could feel the case slipping further into murky waters, the boundaries between what was real and what was imagined becoming increasingly blurred. Once outside, Holmes turned to Watson, his face unreadable. "I believe we now have more than enough to go on. Our next step is clear. We must confront Mason." But even as Holmes spoke, there was something in his voice, a note of caution, perhaps, that made Watson uneasy. There was more to this case than even Holmes had accounted for, and Watson feared that the deeper they dug, the darker the truth would become. The air outside had turned colder by the time Holmes and Watson arrived at Mason's residence, a small, nondescript house tucked away from the main thoroughfare, its worn wooden door bearing the marks of age. The faint smell of damp wood wafted from the cracks in the doorframe, a stark contrast to the overwhelming scent of decay they had just left behind at the butcher's shop. Holmes stood for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the modest house. It was hard to imagine that such a quiet, unremarkable place could hide the secrets they had just uncovered. Yet Holmes knew better. The most dangerous lies often resided in the most ordinary of places. Holmes rapped sharply on the door with his knuckles, the sound loud in the quiet evening. A moment later, the door creaked open to reveal Mason, his face pale and haggard, his eyes darting nervously as though expecting trouble. His thin frame trembled slightly, but he stood in the doorway, reluctant to let them in. The tension in the air was palpable. This was no longer just an investigation for Holmes. It had become a game of psychological chess, and Mason was, for the moment, his most important pawn. "Mason," Holmes began, his voice smooth but firm, "we've come to ask you a few more questions. I believe there's more you haven't told us about the butcher's shop." Mason hesitated, his hand gripping the doorframe tightly as if unsure whether to let them in. "I told you everything I know," he replied, his voice quivering with unease. "There's nothing more to say." Holmes raised an eyebrow, his sharp eyes locking onto Mason's. "I beg to differ," he said, his voice a mixture of curiosity and cold precision. "You see, Mason, people rarely tell the whole truth in the first go. There are things you've left unsaid, and it's those things that I'm interested in." The silence between them stretched for a moment, thick with unspoken tension. Mason's face shifted from nervousness to something else, fear perhaps, or something more primal. Finally he stepped aside, allowing them entry. The air inside was heavier than expected, thick with the smell of stale wood and something faintly metallic. A chill ran down Watson's spine as he stepped into the small entryway, which was dimly lit by a flickering oil lamp. Holmes moved past Mason with a purposeful stride, his sharp eyes taking in the surroundings. The house was modest, nothing grand or extravagant, but there was an unsettling quality to it. The furniture was sparse, yet everything seemed oddly out of place. Furniture stacked in corners as though hastily rearranged, and the remnants of something that might have once been a fire in the hearth, now reduced to cold embers. Mason closed the door softly behind them, his back against it as he watched Holmes and Watson with an uneasy glance. Watson could feel the man's eyes on him, calculating, assessing. It was as if Mason knew that Holmes had already seen through the fragile facade he had carefully constructed around himself. "We know that there is more going on here than you've admitted," Holmes said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "The cellar, the strange objects, the fire, none of it adds up. I've seen the marks on the wall, Mason, marks that speak of something hidden, something you've been trying to conceal." Mason's breath hitched, and his hands shook ever so slightly as he reached for the chair behind him, steadying himself. He remained silent for a long moment, his eyes downcast. But then, as though weighed down by a terrible burden, he spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. "I didn't want to be involved. I never wanted it to go this far." Holmes's eyes were fixed on him, his expression unchanging. "Go on," he prompted, his tone patient but insistent. Mason swallowed hard before he spoke again, his voice trembling. "There's someone I met years ago. He was a customer at the shop, and at first he seemed normal enough, but then he started bringing in things, strange things, items that were not meant for sale. I knew it wasn't right, I knew I shouldn't have gotten involved, but—" He broke off, his voice catching in his throat. Watson exchanged a look with Holmes. He had heard the same fear in the butcher's voice that he had heard in the tavern, the same trembling hesitation. It was as though Mason was terrified of something far more dangerous than just a scandalous crime, something darker, more insidious. Holmes took a step forward, his presence commanding. "Who was he, Mason, this person who brought these things into your shop? And why did you continue to help him?" Mason's face twisted in a mixture of shame and fear. "I don't know his name. He always wore a mask when he came, a black one covering his whole face, and he always paid well, too much for things that weren't even worth half of what he offered." His voice dropped to a near whisper, "But it wasn't the money that kept me involved. It was the power he seemed to wield. He knew things about me, about my past, things I couldn't ignore." Holmes was silent for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. It was clear now that Mason had been drawn into something far larger than he had anticipated. The pieces were starting to fit together. Someone with influence, someone who had been using the shop as a cover for their darker dealings. "You don't know his name?" Holmes asked, his voice cool but probing. Mason shook his head, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who had ventured too far into a world he couldn't escape. "No, he never told me, and when I tried to ask too many questions—" That's when the fire happened. That's when everything changed. The room felt charged with an energy that had not been there before. The flickering oil lamp cast long shadows across the walls, and Mason's ragged breaths were the only sound in the space. Holmes stood still for a moment, his mind spinning with the new information they had gathered. Watson watched him closely, noting the subtle shifts in Holmes's posture. The detective was calculating, his mind working through the fragments of truth, piecing them together like an intricate puzzle. Watson could almost see the deductions forming, one layer at a time, as Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the room once again. Holmes had said little after Mason's confession, only nodding as he took in the details. It was clear now that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple butcher's crime. The mention of a masked figure, the fire, the secrecy, each detail pointed to a far-reaching conspiracy that ran deeper than either of them could have imagined. And yet Holmes remained as composed as ever, never once betraying the emotional weight of what they had uncovered. "You see, Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice soft but filled with that familiar, quiet intensity that always signaled his focus. "The key lies in the fire. Mason has unwittingly revealed something far more telling than he realizes. This man, this masked figure, he's not just any criminal. He's someone who knows how to manipulate fear, how to control the very minds of those he interacts with." Watson took a step closer, his mind racing to keep up with the rapid developments. But Mason didn't even know his name. How could someone like that have so much control over him? Holmes's eyes flickered briefly toward the floor, and he let out a slow, thoughtful breath. "That is the crux of the matter, Watson. This man operates in shadows, and his influence is not dependent on physical power, but rather on psychological control. Think about it. The fire, the secrecy, the payments that were far too generous. It was never about money for Mason. It was about fear. The masked man instilled in him a fear so deep that Mason, who had once been a simple butcher, became complicit in his crimes." Watson's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. "So, you think this man is using fear to get what he wants, forcing Mason into something he couldn't escape from? And the fire?" Holmes nodded, his eyes distant, as though seeing the events unfold before him. "The fire was a warning, Watson, a way of solidifying control. This masked figure wanted Mason to understand that there were consequences for not following orders. But the fire was also a message, a test of loyalty, perhaps. It's no coincidence that after the fire, the butcher shop became a place of grotesque secrecy. The fire was the first step in isolating Mason, in making him dependent on the masked figure's authority." The weight of Holmes's words hung in the air, the implications chilling. Watson felt a tightness in his chest as he absorbed the reality of the situation. And now this man is trying to cover his tracks, with all the jars, the preserved body parts, the strange deliveries. He's hiding something much darker than we've seen so far. Holmes's gaze sharpened as he turned back to Mason, who had been silent throughout their conversation. The butcher stood with his back pressed against the wall, his shoulders slumped in defeat, as though every word they spoke deepened his sense of guilt. Holmes studied him for a long moment, his eyes flicking briefly to the faint scratches on the wall and then back to Mason. "You've been complicit, Mason," Holmes said, his tone almost gentle but unmistakably firm. "But it is not too late to undo some of the damage you've caused. You must help us. Tell us everything you know about this man, his movements, his connections, anyone who might be involved." Mason shifted uneasily, his eyes avoiding Holmes's gaze. I told you, I don't know who he is. He always wore the mask, never showed his face. I don't even know how he knew about my past, how he knew the things he knew." Holmes's lips thinned, a flash of frustration crossing his face before he masked it once more. "Then tell me what you do know, Mason. Start with the fire. Who else was there? Who else might have been involved?" Mason's shoulders sagged, and for a moment he seemed to collapse inward, his mind retreating to a darker place. The fire. I wasn't the only one there. There were others, people who worked for him. They came and went. I didn't know their names, but I saw their faces even though they kept to the shadows. The masked man. They would all listen to him. They respected him. And I... His voice faltered, breaking under the weight of his own guilt. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Mason's. Mason, you have to understand. This man is dangerous and he is still out there. You may not have known the full extent of what you were involved in, but you do now. If you want to make things right, you need to give us the information we need. Watson could see that Mason was teetering on the edge of something, whether it was a final break from the terror that had haunted him, or the complete unraveling of his psyche. But there was a part of him, buried deep within, that still held on to the hope of redemption. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mason nodded slightly, his voice shaky but filled with reluctant resolve. I'll tell you what I know, but you have to promise me that no one else will get hurt. Holmes's eyes softened just for a moment. I promise, Mason. Now, tell us everything. The silence in Mason's small house felt suffocating as the detective, the doctor, and the butcher stood in the dimly lit room. Holmes's sharp eyes never left Mason, his every word, every movement calibrated for maximum effect. The confession was now out in the open. The shadowy figure who had haunted Mason's life was slowly being drawn out from the darkness. It was clear that they were on the cusp of something much larger than they had originally anticipated. This was not just a matter of a butcher's shop gone wrong. No, this was a deliberate orchestration of power, control, and fear, and behind it all, a figure pulling the strings, one who was still out there, lurking in the unseen corners of the city. Holmes's mind raced through the details, piecing together the fragments Mason had shared. The masked figure, the sinister deliveries, the fear that had shackled Mason to this horrific existence. It all began to make sense. But there was still one missing piece. Who was this masked figure? The man who wielded such power over Mason and others like him. The question gnawed at Holmes, an itch he could not scratch, and yet he knew that in time he would uncover the truth. Holmes turned to Watson, his voice calm but filled with urgency. Watson, we must move quickly. The more time we waste, the greater the risk of this man vanishing entirely. Watson nodded, his thoughts mirroring Holmes's. His mind whirled with questions, yet he felt the unmistakable certainty in Holmes's voice, the knowledge that they were mere moments away from unmasking the very heart of this conspiracy, the man who had orchestrated the butcher's shop charade, the one whose influence had twisted everything around him, was still out there, somewhere, just beyond their reach. Mason stepped forward, his face pale and drawn. I told you everything, but I never saw his face. He always wore the mask. But I know, his voice faltered as he looked between Holmes and Watson, fear still evident in his eyes. I know where he's going next. I know what he plans to do. Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. You do? His tone was measured, though the undercurrent of anticipation was palpable. Mason nodded, his hands trembling at his sides. He's going after someone important. I don't know who, exactly, but he said he needed someone with influence, a person who could help him expand his reach. I think he's going after someone in power, someone who can protect him. Holmes's gaze sharpened, his mind racing ahead. A person of influence? He repeated the words slowly, as if turning them over in his mind. Then it seems we have little time to lose. Without another word, Holmes turned and strode toward the door, his steps purposeful. Watson was already moving behind him, and Mason, though clearly reluctant, followed at a distance, his hands still trembling. The weight of what had just been revealed seemed to press down on the small house, leaving a suffocating tension in its wake. Outside, the fog had thickened even more, curling around the street lamps and blurring the edges of the city. It felt as though the entire world had disappeared into the mist, leaving only the figures of Holmes, Watson, and Mason to navigate through the darkened streets. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps as they moved swiftly toward their destination. Holmes, Watson said, breaking the silence as he matched his stride with the detective's. If Mason is right, and this man is going after someone in power, then this could be far more dangerous than we imagined. Whoever he is, he's working on a much larger scale than we thought." Holmes did not reply immediately, his face set in an expression of deep concentration. His mind was already piecing together the final elements of the puzzle, the connections between the masked man and those who could protect him, those who had the power to shield him from the law. Holmes had seen this pattern before, the way power could manipulate, could corrupt. He knew deep in his bones that the next steps they took would be the most critical of all. As they approached the outskirts of the city, where the buildings grew sparse and the streets became quieter, Holmes stopped abruptly, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. There, just ahead, stood a large, imposing building, a manor, its silhouette looming in the fog. It was unmistakable. Watson's breath caught in his throat. "The estate of Lord Blackwell," he whispered. "The very man who controls half the city's affairs." Holmes's lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. "Precisely," he said softly. "And I believe it is there that we will find the man we seek. The mask will be removed at last." Without another word, Holmes led the way toward the manor, the weight of the moment hanging heavy on their shoulders. They were no longer chasing shadows. They were about to confront the darkness itself, and in doing so they would finally unravel the twisted web that had ensnared so many. But Holmes knew one thing for certain: the truth was more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The heavy mist wrapped around the manor, thickening the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Holmes, Watson and Mason stood at the entrance to Lord Blackwell's estate, the looming gates before them like a threshold to another world, one that was far darker than they had ever imagined. Holmes's eyes never wavered as he looked at the imposing structure, his mind already working through the implications of what they were about to uncover. Watson, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his stomach. This was it, the final confrontation, the culmination of everything they had discovered, and yet it felt as though the very air around them was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Holmes stepped forward, his hand brushing lightly against the cold iron gate. He could feel the weight of everything that had led them here: the butcher's shop, the mysterious deliveries, the masked man who had orchestrated it all from the shadows. And now they stood on the cusp of unmasking the person who had pulled the strings, the person whose influence had corrupted everything in its path. Mason's voice trembled as he spoke, his words breaking the tense silence. "Are you sure this is the right place?" he asked, his eyes flicking nervously between Holmes and Watson. The man, the masked one, he said he would come here. He would meet with Lord Blackwell. Holmes nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. "I have no doubt, Mason. This is where everything leads. The fire, the fear, the strange deliveries. It all points to Blackwell." Watson glanced at Holmes, his mind still racing to comprehend the situation. But why Lord Blackwell? What's his connection to all of this? Why would he be involved? Holmes's gaze sharpened. Power, Watson. Control. The masked figure was not just a man with a mask. He was a symbol, someone who wielded influence over those who craved it. Lord Blackwell, with his wealth and standing, is the perfect target for someone like him. The masked man needed to infiltrate those in power, and Blackwell, with his vast influence, was the key. They walked in silence for a moment, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only sound. The manor loomed larger with each step they took, its windows dark and foreboding. The oppressive atmosphere seemed to draw in the light, casting everything in an eerie, shadowed hue. The front doors were wide open, as if inviting them in. As they entered the manor, the air grew colder still. The grand hall stretched before them, its high ceilings draped in shadow, the only light coming from the faint flicker of candlelight in the distance. It was an unsettling, oppressive place, a place where secrets had been buried deep, where power and fear had festered unchecked. Holmes paused at the entrance to the main hall, his eyes scanning the room with practiced ease. "There's something here," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Something hidden, something waiting." Mason stood back, trembling. I don't want to be part of this anymore. Please, I don't want to know what happens next." Holmes turned to him then, his expression softened, though there was still a sharp edge to his voice. "You've already helped us, Mason. You've provided the most critical piece of the puzzle. Now, stay close. You'll be safe as long as you remain with us." They moved deeper into the manor, the faint sounds of movement coming from the shadows ahead. It wasn't long before they heard the low murmur of voices, two figures standing in the far corner of the room. Holmes's eyes locked onto them, and he gestured for Watson to move quietly behind him. As they approached, the voices became clearer, and Watson's breath caught in his throat when he recognized one of them. It was Lord Blackwell, his unmistakable voice filled with a strange calmness, a sense of finality in his words. "You've done well," Blackwell's voice echoed as he spoke to a shadowy figure beside him. "Everything is falling into place. The plan will soon be complete." Holmes took a step forward, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "It's over, Blackwell. Your games are finished." Both figures turned sharply at the sound of Holmes's voice, their expressions shifting in an instant from calm to something more dangerous. Lord Blackwell's eyes narrowed as he recognized the detective, a sneer curling on his lips. The masked man stood beside him, his features hidden once more beneath the black cloth. "You think you've won, Holmes?" Blackwell sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think that by exposing me you can erase everything that's been built? The city has been mine to control for years. This is only the beginning." Holmes's gaze flickered to the masked figure, his eyes narrowing. "Your influence has been built on fear, Blackwell, and fear has a way of crumbling when it is faced head-on. You were never as untouchable as you believed." The tension in the room thickened as the masked man stepped forward, his presence ominous in the low light. Holmes stood tall, his eyes never wavering, his mind already calculating his next move. There was no turning back now. The game was over, and they were about to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Holmes took a step forward, his voice low and controlled. "You've manipulated and used people for far too long, but now it's your turn to answer for it." The masked figure made a sudden movement, but before anyone could react, Holmes's quick thinking and sharp instincts took over. He lunged forward, knocking the figure's arm aside and revealing the face beneath the mask. The truth was finally exposed.